In a small, quiet village, nestled deep in the misty Irish countryside, lived a young woman named Aisling. She had recently moved to the village to escape the bustling city life, seeking solace and a fresh start. The village was charming, with its rolling hills, old stone cottages, and the serene stillness that seemed to envelop everything. The locals were kind but reserved, often exchanging whispered words when Aisling passed by. She noticed the uneasy glances, the hushed conversations that would stop it when she entered the room. But she paid them little to mind. It wasn't long before she learned of the village's strange tradition, a dark legend passed down through generations, one that had haunted the families here for centuries. The Banshee, they told her, was a spirit who wailed to warn of an impending death. Her mournful cry, they said, was a harbinger of doom, a sign that someone in the family was about to pass. The villagers spoke of her with both fear and respect, for the Banshee was not a figure to be trifled with. It was said that her wail was not a mere sound, but an omen, a promise that death would soon visit. At first, Aisling dismissed it as superstition, a relic of old folklore. She'd never believed in ghosts or spirits, and certainly not in an entity like the Banshee. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. It started with the winds, soft, mournful gusts that seemed to howl through the trees even when the air was still. Aisling would hear whispers in the night, faint and distant, just on the edge of her hearing. At first, she assumed it was the wind, but then she noticed something odd. The animals seemed unsettled. Her neighbor's dog, who was normally friendly, would bark frantically and refuse to enter the yard after dusk. The birds, too, stopped singing at night, their silence filling the air with an eerie tension. One evening, as Aisling was walking home from the village square, she heard it. At first, it was faint, a distant wail carried on the breeze. It sounded almost like a woman crying, but there was something unnaturally sorrowful about it, a deep, resonating grief that seemed to touch something inside her. She shook it off, telling herself it was just the wind playing tricks. But as she walked faster, the cry grew louder, closer, almost as if it were following her. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every time Aisling closed her eyes, she saw the same image. A woman standing at the edge of the forest, her long, flowing hair billowing around her, her face twisted in sorrow. Her wail echoed through the dreamscape, growing louder, sharper with every passing moment. The woman's eyes were filled with an unspeakable sadness. But when Aisling tried to call out to her, the woman's face twisted in fury, and the wail became a scream of anguish. Aisling awoke in a cold sweat, heart pounding in her chest. The silence in her room was deafening, but the haunting cry from her dream lingered in her mind. Was it just a nightmare? Or had something far darker reached out to her? The next day, she spoke to an elderly woman in the village, Mrs. O'Malley, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. Mrs. O'Malley had lived in the village all her life, and when Aisling mentioned the wail, the old woman's face darkened. "You've heard it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The Banshee." Aisling nodded, feeling a chill crawl up her spine. "Every family in this village has heard her wail, sooner or later." Mrs. O'Malley continued, "The Banshee does not come without a reason. She comes to warn. She comes to tell you that someone you love will soon die, Aisling felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had heard the wail, and it was growing stronger with each passing night. But who? Who in her family would the Banshee be warning about? That evening, the wail came again. This time it was unmistakable. The sound pierced the night air, rising from a distant hill and growing louder with every passing second. It was a sound unlike anything Aisling had ever heard. Desperate, heart-wrenching, as if the very earth was mourning. She tried to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The wail grew louder still, surrounding her, closing in on her like a storm. Terrified, Aisling raced to the village's church, hoping to find some comfort in the sanctuary of its stone walls. But as she reached the door, she stopped in her tracks. Standing at the edge of the graveyard, bathed in an otherworldly light, was the figure from her dream, the woman, the Banshee. Her long hair floated around her face, and her gown billowed in the wind, despite the lack of breeze. The woman's face was as twisted as Aisling had seen in her nightmares. Her eyes filled with an unbearable sadness. As Aisling had seen in her nightmares, her eyes filled with an unbearable sadness. As Aisling froze in fear, the Banshee raised her arms, and her wail reached a crescendo that shook the very ground beneath Aisling's feet. "It's too late," the Banshee whispered, her voice now a low, mournful cry that echoed through Aisling's soul. "Your fate, it is sealed." Aisling turned and ran, the wail still ringing in her ears. But it was clear that there was no escaping it. The curse had been set in motion, and the Banshee had delivered her message. Death was coming for someone in Aisling's family. But who? The following day, Aisling received the news that her father had passed away suddenly, his heart giving out without warning. She felt the weight of the Banshee's prophecy settle heavily on her shoulders, the grief of her loss compounded by the knowledge that the wail had come to warn her, just as it had warned so many others before her. As Aisling stood at her father's gravesite, she heard it once more. The wail. This time, it was faint, but unmistakable. Somewhere in the distance, the Banshee's cry echoed through the hills. A reminder that death was always near, always waiting. And with that final wail, Aisling understood. The Banshee would always be watching, always waiting. And when she cried, it was not just a warning, it was a promise that death would come for all who heard her song. Please subscribe, comment, share your ideas or suggestions for improvement, like, share and repost to help me reach more Irish audiences with my scary horror Irish folktale stories.